When the Third Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, the world turned its gaze toward the ruins of Hitler's Germany with a mixture of relief, horror, and an overwhelming thirst for justice. The men who had orchestrated one of history's darkest chapters faced tribunals, prison cells, and in many cases, the hangman's noose. But what of the women who stood beside them? What happened to the wives who had hosted lavish dinner parties in stolen mansions, who had worn diamonds ripped from Jewish families, who had smiled for propaganda cameras while their husbands signed orders sending millions to their deaths? And what became of the children? Those boys and girls who had grown up in the lap of absolute power, raised in households where Hitler himself was a family friend, and the symbols of mass murder were simply the backdrop to ordinary family life. Their stories are complicated, morally unsettling, and in many cases almost entirely unknown to the public. Some of these women and children lived out long, quiet lives under the radar of history. Others became active defenders of the men they loved, fighting to rehabilitate legacies that most of the world considered irredeemably criminal. A few took the opposite path, turning their backs on their fathers and husbands entirely, dedicating themselves to acknowledging the evil they had been born into. In this video, we will explore the extraordinary and often disturbing post-war lives of the wives and children of Nazi Germany's most powerful men. So without further ado, let's start with the first name on our list. Ilse Hess was one of the most devoted wives in the history of the Third Reich, a woman whose loyalty to the Nazi cause and to her husband Rudolf Hess never wavered even as the world around her crumbled and burned. Ilse was born Ilse Pröll in 1900, the daughter of a doctor, and she was a highly educated woman for her time, having studied at university during the tumultuous years of Germany's post-World War I. Chaos. She was drawn into the orbit of the nascent National Socialist movement in the early 1920s, a period when the movement was still relatively small and centered around the charismatic agitation of Adolf Hitler. Ilse first joined the Nazi Party in 1921, making her one of its earliest female adherents, and although the party was banned temporarily and she rejoined in 1925 after it was reconstituted, her commitment to its ideology never faltered during the intervening years. Her relationship with Rudolf Hess began in the early 1920s and developed slowly. Hess was by nature a cautious and somewhat hesitant personality, and he reportedly dragged his feet when it came to formalizing his romantic intentions toward Ilse. In a remarkable twist that reveals just how deeply intertwined Hitler was with the personal lives of his inner circle, it was Hitler himself who played a significant role in nudging Hess toward marriage. Hitler attended social gatherings organized by wealthy women, sympathetic to the movement, and he appears to have actively encouraged Hess to commit to Ilse. The wedding finally took place on December 20th, 1927 in Munich, with Hitler in attendance as a guest of honor. The connections between the two families only deepened when their son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, was born in 1937, and Hitler agreed to serve as the boy's godfather. This personal intimacy with the Führer placed Ilse in an extraordinarily privileged position within Nazi society, a position she embraced and defended for the rest of her long life. Throughout the years of the Third Reich, Ilse served as one of the movement's most visible wives, attending rallies, supporting party functions, and maintaining the social networks that kept the inner circle cohesive. When her husband made his extraordinary and still partially mysterious solo flight to Scotland in May 1941, ostensibly to negotiate a private peace deal with Britain, Ilse found herself in a deeply uncomfortable position. The R&uuml mission failed catastrophically. Hess was captured by the British, Hitler was furious and publicly disowned him, and Ilse was left to navigate the sudden disgrace of her husband without any official support from the regime she had given her life to. Yet she defended Rudolf's intentions steadfastly, insisting to anyone who would listen that he had acted out of genuine idealism and a desire to prevent further bloodshed, a characterization that official Nazi Germany explicitly rejected. After Germany's defeat in May 1945, Ilse was swept up in the Allied internment operations that rounded up the families and close associates of senior Nazi figures. She was arrested and sent to an internment camp in Augsburg, one of the many holding facilities established across the Allied occupation zones, to process the vast network of Nazi-affiliated individuals. The internment was eventually resolved, and Ilse was released to begin the difficult process of rebuilding a life in a country that had been, physically and morally, devastated. She moved to the Allgäu region of Bavaria, a picturesque area in the southern German foothills that had been a retreat for many Nazis before the war, and by 1955 she had established herself there by opening a boarding house. This modest business gave her financial independence and a degree of social anonymity, allowing her to live a life that, on the surface, resembled that of any ordinary German woman of her era. But Ilse Hess was not an ordinary woman, and she never pretended to be. Her inner ideological commitments remained entirely unchanged by the catastrophe of Nazi Germany's defeat. She remained a devoted believer in National Socialism and in the personal virtue of Adolf Hitler until the very end of her life. She provided active support to an organization called Stille Hilfe, which translates as Silent Aid, a secretive network that offered assistance to former SS members who had been arrested, condemned, or were in flight from justice. Through Stille Hilfe, former Nazis could receive financial support, legal assistance, and help obtaining false papers, all of which amounted to a systematic effort to protect war criminals from accountability. Ilse's involvement with this organization placed her firmly in the camp of those who never accepted the moral reckoning that post-war Germany was slowly and painfully undertaking. In 1952, she published a book with the cumbersome title England, Nürnberg, Spandau, ein Schicksal in Briefen, which translates roughly as England, Nuremberg, Spandau, a fate in letters. The book compiled correspondence between herself and Rudolf during his long years of captivity, first in British custody and then in Spandau prison in West Berlin, and it attracted a certain readership among those who continued to see Rudolf Hess as a misunderstood peace seeker rather than a leading architect of Nazi tyranny. The correspondence was published partly as a rehabilitation effort, designed to present Rudolf as a man of principle who had been punished for his idealism, and it found a sympathetic audience among the remnants of far-right German politics in the early 1950s. The defining cause of Ilse's post-war life, however, was the campaign to secure her husband's release from Spandau prison. Rudolf Hess had been sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg trials, a verdict that distinguished him from many of his fellow defendants who were sentenced to death. As the years and then decades passed and Hess remained the sole prisoner in Spandau, an anomaly maintained by the four Allied powers who had jointly administered the prison since 1946, the question of his continued incarceration became a matter of international debate. Ilse was at the centre of this campaign, writing letters, giving interviews, and working with her son Wolf to rally political and public support for Rudolf's release. The campaign never succeeded. Rudolf Hess died in Spandau on August 17, 1987, at the remarkable age of 93, officially by suicide through hanging, though his family never accepted this verdict and insisted he had been murdered. Ilse Hess survived her husband by 8 years, passing away on September 7, 1995, at the age of 95. She left behind a complex and deeply troubling legacy, that of a woman who chose ideological fidelity over moral clarity and spent her long life defending a regime responsible for incomprehensible crimes against humanity. Turning now to another figure who embodies the troubling complexity of Nazi wives, we come to Margarete Himmler, the wife of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, the man who served as the primary architect of the Holocaust and the head of the SS apparatus that administered the death camps. Margaret's story is in some ways even more dissonant than Ilse Hess's because of the particular irony embedded in her biography. Before she became Heinrich Himmler's wife, Margarete had trained as a nurse, motivated by a genuine desire to heal and save lives during the carnage of World War I. After the armistice, she transitioned to working with the German Red Cross Hospital, and with financial support from her father, she eventually managed her own private nursing clinic. This was a woman who had built her early professional identity around the preservation of human life. And yet she would marry and actively support the man who presided over the systematic murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazi regime. Margarete first met Heinrich Himmler in 1927 during one of his lecture tours, the kind of public speaking engagements that helped build the Nazi movement's profile during the years before it seized power. Heinrich was immediately attracted to Margarete, captivated by her blue eyes, blonde hair, and the kind of Nordic appearance that Nazi racial ideology placed at the apex of its hierarchy of human worth. Despite some initial complications, including Heinrich's concern about how his Catholic family would receive Margarete given the age difference between them, her previous marriage, and her Protestant faith, the relationship moved forward. They married in July 1928, and the family grew quickly with the birth of their daughter, Gudrun, on August 8, 1929. Margarete was not a passive observer of her husband's activities. She joined the Nazi Party in 1928, the same year they married, and she took an active interest in the social dimensions of the SS hierarchy. She regularly organized gatherings for the wives of high-ranking SS leaders, attempting to create the kind of structured social network that reflected her husband's obsession with order and hierarchy in every sphere of life. These efforts were not always warmly received. By most accounts, Margarete was notably unpopular among the other women of the SS inner circle, a fact that became particularly evident during the Nuremberg Rally of 1938, when a group of the other wives collectively refused to follow, her lead presenting a rare instance of insubordination within the otherwise rigidly hierarchical world of SS social life. As the war intensified, Margarete's activities took on a more directly operational character. By the end of 1939, she was overseeing the operation of Red Cross hospitals throughout the Berlin-Brandenburg region, a role that sent her on inspection missions to German-occupied territories. In March 1940, she visited Poland, a country that had been under German military occupation since September of the previous year, and had already become the site of systematic mass atrocities against both Polish civilians and the Jewish population concentrated in its cities. In her diary entry from this visit, Margarete recorded her impressions of what she witnessed in Poznan, Lodz and Warsaw, and those words offer a chilling window into the mindset of a woman who had built her early career on healing. She described the Jewish population as a rabble who barely appeared human to her and wrote with disgust about the living conditions in the occupied cities, conditions that were directly created by the German occupation policies her husband was instrumental in enforcing. It is a document that makes any attempt to portray Margarete as merely an ignorant bystander to Heinrich's crimes extraordinarily difficult. Margarete achieved the rank of colonel within the German Red Cross through her wartime activities, a recognition of the organizational work she carried out in service of the occupation apparatus. Yet even as she rose within this official structure, her marriage was falling apart in private. Margarete discovered in 1941 that Heinrich was conducting an affair with his secretary, Hedwig Potthast, with whom he would eventually have 2 illegitimate children. This discovery was shattering on a personal level, and the marriage effectively ended emotionally, even as it continued officially. The couple shared a final meeting in April 1945 as Germany's defeat became inevitable, and the world Heinrich had built was collapsing around them. When the war ended, Margarete faced multiple investigations into her knowledge of her husband's crimes. She denied any awareness of the extent of the Holocaust and pleaded for clearance from Nazi association, seeking to be judged separately from the actions of the man she had married and remained beside for nearly 2 decades. The investigations dragged on for years, a reflection of the enormous difficulty Allied and German authorities faced in passing the individual responsibility of women who had lived so close to power. Finally, in 1953, 8 years after the war's end, a German denazification court reached its verdict. Margarete Himmler was deemed to have been a profiteer of the Nazi regime, a conclusion that stopped well short of holding her responsible for the crimes against humanity her husband had orchestrated, but that acknowledged she had materially benefited from his monstrous power. She was sentenced to 30 days of penal labour and stripped of both her voting rights and her eligibility for a state pension. After her release, she retreated from public life as completely as she could, living under the assumed name Margarete Boden, and doing her best to disappear into the anonymity of post-war German society. She died in 1967, still under her pseudonym, never having publicly reckoned with the full implications of the life she had lived. Lina Heydrich occupies perhaps the most morally complex position of all the Nazi wives. A woman who, by most accounts, not only supported her husband's rise to becoming one of the most feared men in the Third Reich, but actively participated in creating the conditions for that rise, and who spent the rest of her life aggressively defending his legacy long after the world had reached its verdict about what Reinhard Heydrich represented in history. Born Lina von Osten in 1911, she came from a strongly nationalist family. Her brother Hans was an ardent member of both the Nazi Party and the SA, the paramilitary organisation that served as the street-fighting arm of the early Nazi movement, and his enthusiastic advocacy for the party drew Lina to attend a rally in 1929. She heard Hitler speak that day, and his words had a profound impact on her, prompting her to join the Nazi Party on the spot. She was 19 years old and already committed to the ideology that would shape the rest of her life. It was at a rowing club ball in Kiel in the winter of 1930 that Lina first encountered Naval Lieutenant Reinhard Heydrich. The attraction was immediate and powerful, and the two became engaged with remarkable speed, with the engagement formally announced on December 18, 1930. But the early days of their relationship were immediately overshadowed by scandal. The following year, Heydrich faced a naval honour court on charges of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman, stemming from allegations that he had violated a prior engagement promise to a woman he had been romantically involved with for 6 months before beginning his relationship with Lina. The honour court found against him, and he was dismissed from the Navy in April 1931, leaving him without a career or income and with a damaged reputation. This moment of crisis turned out to be the pivot around which the entire trajectory of both their lives would turn. It was Lina, according to historical accounts, who first suggested that Reinhard consider the SS as a new avenue for his ambitions. She had connections within the Nazi movement through her brother and her own party membership, and she saw in the newly growing SS an organisation that might offer Reinhard a fresh start. Heydrich's talent for intelligence work became apparent almost immediately when he began developing ideas for an SS intelligence service, and these proposals so impressed Heinrich Himmler that he moved quickly to appoint Heydrich as chief of the newly formed intelligence service that would later be known as the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, or Security Service. It was a fateful appointment. Reinhard Heydrich would go on to become one of the most powerful and feared figures in the Third Reich, the head of the Reich Main Security Office that controlled all of Germany's security and intelligence apparatus, the man who chaired the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where the final solution was formally coordinated, and the man whom even Hitler reportedly described as the man with the iron heart. He was assassinated by Czech and Slovak paratroopers in Prague in May 1942. In recognition of her husband's dedication to the Nazi cause, Hitler gifted Lina with a large estate in rural Bohemia, a tangible expression of the regime's gratitude for the services the Heydrich family had rendered. Lina was not a passive recipient of this gift. At the estate, she kept prisoners for forced labour, and it was alleged by those who survived that she subjected these prisoners to physical abuse. The family remained at the estate until April 1945, when they joined the mass westward flight of German civilians and officials attempting to escape the advancing Soviet Red Army. After the war, Lina Heydrich navigated the denazification process with remarkable success, at least within the confines of the West German legal system. She was acquitted in the denazification proceedings, a verdict that seemed extraordinary given her husband's central role in the Holocaust. She then pursued 2 court battles against the West German government in 1956 and again in 1959, successfully arguing that she was entitled to a pension as the widow of a senior German official. The courts agreed, and Lina was awarded her pension, a decision that caused significant controversy, given that her husband had been one of the primary architects of the systematic mass murder of European Jews. Meanwhile, Czechoslovakia, the country where Reinhard Heydrich had ruled as Reich Protector of Bohemia, and Moravia, and where he had been assassinated, convicted Lina in absentia and sentenced her to life imprisonment. This sentence, however, remained entirely theoretical, as she lived safely in West Germany, where Czechoslovak jurisdiction could not reach her. In 1965, during a vacation to Finland, Lina met Mauno Manninen, a Finnish theatre director. The relationship developed into marriage, and Lina has been candid in historical accounts that one of her primary motivations for the marriage was the opportunity it gave her to change her surname and escape some of the immediate association with the name Heydrich. After the marriage, she returned to Germany and took over management of her late first husband's former summer house on the island of Fehmarn in the Baltic Sea, converting it into a restaurant and inn that she ran until an accident caused a fire that destroyed the property. In 1976, she published her memoir, provocatively titled Life with a War Criminal, a book that caused immediate controversy because rather than being a work of confession or remorse, it was a sustained defense of Reinhard Heydrich and an attack on the historical verdict that had judged him one of the most culpable figures of the Nazi era. She defended his memory tirelessly and combatively until her death on August 14, 1985, at the age of 74. Emmy Goering was in many respects the grandest of all the Nazi wives. the woman who most fully embodied the theatrical and almost operatic excess that characterized the upper reaches of Third Reich social life. Born Emmy Sonnemann in 1893, she was a professional actress who had built a substantial career in the German theatre before her fateful encounter with Hermann Göring. She married Hermann on April 10, 1935, in a ceremony that was itself a piece of Nazi theatre, attended by Hitler and countless senior officials, a spectacle that announced to the German public that even the highest figures of the regime had personal lives and human feelings. Carefully curated imagery designed to soften the brutal face of the state. Emmy's entry into the formal structures of the Nazi Party came later and in a fashion that perfectly captured the strange way normal social customs bent and warped within the Third Reich. She was given Nazi Party membership as a Christmas present in 1938, a gift that underscored how thoroughly the party had permeated every aspect of German life. Emmy quickly established herself as the dominant social hostess of the Nazi hierarchy, hosting Hitler at state functions with a confidence and flair that drew on her theatrical training. She styled herself with no apparent irony as the First Lady of the Third Reich, a self-designation that put her on a direct collision course with Eva Braun, Hitler's long-term companion who was kept deliberately in the shadows of official life but who naturally resented any other woman claiming informal queenly status over Nazi society. Emmy openly disregarded Eva and treated her with undisguised disdain, refusing to extend to Hitler's companion the basic social courtesies that would have been expected in any other social setting. This behaviour infuriated Hitler himself, who reportedly demanded that Hermann instruct Emmy to treat Eva with proper respect. One consequence of Emmy's contemptuous attitude toward Eva was her exclusion from the Berghof, Hitler's Bavarian mountain retreat, where the inner circle gathered for informal weekends, a significant social slight in the ferociously status-conscious world of Nazi elite society. The material circumstances of Emmy's life during the war years were extraordinary, even by the standards of an elite that was systematically stripping the continent of its wealth. Hermann Göring had built himself an empire of stolen property, acquiring mansions, estates and castles across Germany, Austria and Poland through the systematic confiscation of art and wealth from Jewish families and from political enemies of the regime. Emmy lived in this looted luxury without apparent discomfort or moral qualm, hosting guests at Karenhall, their vast estate north of Berlin, entertaining on a scale that would have been remarkable even in peacetime. When their only child, Edda, was born, Hermann Göring marked the occasion with a display of military power that perfectly captured the absurdity and excess of the man's personality. He commanded a tribute of 500 aircraft to fly over Berlin to celebrate the birth of his daughter, adding that he would have doubled the number had the child been a son. After Germany's defeat, Emmy faced the reckoning that her wartime life had made inevitable. A German denazification court considered her case and found her guilty of being an active Nazi, a verdict that reflected her enthusiastic participation in the regime's social life and her material benefit from its crimes. She was sentenced to 1 year of incarceration, and upon her release she found that 30% of what remained of her substantial wealth had been confiscated. Additionally, she was prohibited from performing on stage for a period of 5 years, a restriction that permanently damaged her ability to return to the professional career that had defined her before the war. The grand life was over. Emmy Göring moved into a small apartment in Munich, a profound material come down from the vast stolen estates where she had played the First Lady of the Reich. She eventually wrote an autobiography titled My Life with Göring, which offered her own perspective on her extraordinary life, though it was not received as a particularly searching piece of self-examination. Emmy Göring died in Munich on June 8, 1973, at the age of 80. Leaving behind a life that had risen from the stage to the pinnacle of a criminal empire and then descended to a modest flat in a city still working through the trauma of what that empire had done. Another wife whose post-war story deserves careful attention is that of Gerda Bormann, the wife of Martin Bormann, who served as the head of the Nazi Party chancellery and became one of Hitler's most powerful and feared officials in the final years of the war. Gerda was an ardent National Socialist herself, committed to the ideology in ways that went beyond mere wifely loyalty. She and Martin had 10 children together, a brood that reflected both the Nazi state's emphasis on large Aryan families and Gerda's personal devotion to the domestic dimensions of Nazi ideology. Martin Bormann, meanwhile, conducted a series of extramarital affairs with something approaching brazenness, and in what must be one of the most extraordinary domestic arrangements in the history of any regime, he actually wrote to Gerda urging her to befriend his mistress, the actress Manja Behrens, and suggesting that the two women might find ways to cooperate in managing his affections. Even more remarkably, Gerda accepted this situation with a degree of compliance that shocked even some of their contemporaries within the Nazi inner circle. Gerda Bormann's post-war story was defined by tragedy and early death rather than the extended post-war lives of some of the other Nazi wives. As Germany collapsed in 1945, she found herself in the Tyrol region with her children, cut off from her husband, who remained in Berlin in Hitler's bunker until the very last days of the war. Martin Bormann's fate, after Hitler's death on April 30th, 1945, remained one of the enduring mysteries of the immediate post-war period. For decades, his death was not confirmed, and there were persistent rumours that he had escaped to South America, as other Nazis had done. Gerda never learned what had become of her husband. She had developed cancer during the war, and the illness progressed rapidly in the difficult conditions of post-war Germany. She died in Merano, in northern Italy, on March 23, 1946, less than a year after the war's end, aged only 34. Her children were left to navigate their father's notorious legacy without either parent to guide them. Martin Bormann's actual fate was eventually confirmed decades later when construction workers in Berlin, in 1972, uncovered skeletal remains that were identified as his through dental records, confirming that he had died in Berlin in the chaotic final days of the war in 1945 and had never escaped at all. The case of Anneliese von Ribbentrop, the wife of Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, offers yet another variation on the pattern of Nazi wives navigating the post-war world with varying degrees of accountability. Joachim von Ribbentrop had been one of the most prominent figures in Nazi foreign policy, the man responsible for negotiating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union in 1939, and for serving as Hitler's principal instrument of diplomacy as Germany pursued its aggressive expansionist agenda. He was among the most prominent defendants at the Nuremberg trials and was sentenced to death and executed on October 16, 1946. Anneliese, who had been a wealthy businesswoman's daughter before her marriage to Joachim and who retained connections to money and social networks that proved useful in the post-war chaos, faced her own denazification proceedings but managed to avoid significant legal consequences. She spent the post-war decades working on her late husband's rehabilitation, believing firmly that history had judged him unjustly, and she collaborated with right-wing publishers to produce materials defending his legacy. She lived until 1973, dying the same year as Emmy Goering, and like Emmy, in circumstances far removed from the power and luxury of her wartime years. The story of Henriette von Schirach, wife of Reich youth leader and later Vienna Gauleiter Baldur von Schirach, is in some respects more surprising than many of the others because it contains an early moment of conscience that was extraordinarily rare in the world of Nazi wives. Henriette was the daughter of Hitler's personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, and had grown up in Hitler's social circle. She married Baldur von Schirach in 1932, becoming one of the most socially prominent women in Nazi Germany. During the war years, she had occasion to witness directly some of the brutality that Nazi policy was inflicting on the Jewish population. In 1943, she reportedly told Hitler directly that she had witnessed a roundup of Dutch Jews in Amsterdam and found it horrifying and wrong. Hitler was furious at her intervention and effectively banished her from his inner circle. This rare act of vocal conscience within the Nazi hierarchy is historically notable, even as it must be viewed with appropriate skepticism about how much it reflected genuine moral awareness versus selective sensitivity to what she personally witnessed, given that she had long been embedded in the regime's social structures and had benefited enormously from its power. Baldur von Schirach was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, which he served in full at Spandau Prison, being released in 1966. Henriette did not wait for him. She divorced Baldur while he was in prison, a decision that set her apart from wives like Ilse Hess, who maintained their loyalty throughout decades of captivity. After the divorce, Henriette wrote her memoirs, which were published in 1967 under the title The Price of Glory, offering a portrait of life within Hitler's social circle that was widely read, if not universally trusted, as a reliable historical document. She died in 1992. What happened to Baldur von Schirach after his release from Spandau in 1966 is itself a notable post-war story. Unlike many former senior Nazis who sought anonymity, von Schirach appeared at least intermittently in public, and in his later years expressed what seemed to be genuine remorse for his role in the regime. He died in Kröv in 1974. Now we turn to the children of these powerful men, and what we find there is perhaps even more fascinating and disturbing than the stories of the wives, because the children had no choice in the families they were born into, and yet were forced to carry those family names and everything associated with them for the rest of their lives. Some of them chose to defend their fathers and mothers with an almost reflexive loyalty that spoke to the deepest bonds of family identity. Others chose the path of public renunciation, transforming their painful inheritance into a platform for historical education and moral witness. And some simply tried to disappear, to change their names and slip into anonymous ordinary lives as far as possible from the shadow of what their fathers had done. The question of what the children owe to history, whether they bear any responsibility for crimes committed before they were old enough to understand them, and what their lives can teach us about the nature of complicity and conscience, runs through every one of these stories and gives them a weight that goes beyond mere historical curiosity. Gudrun Himmler, born on August 8, 1929, was the only legitimate child of Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, and her life story represents one of the most uncompromising examples of filial loyalty that the post-war era produced. She was, by all accounts, the apple of her father's eye. Heinrich Himmler, the administrator of mass murder, the man who oversaw the entire concentration camp system and the Einsatzgruppen death squads, was apparently a devoted father in the private domestic sphere, and he maintained an extraordinary level of attentiveness toward Gudrun throughout her childhood. When she was living with her mother in Munich, away from her father's Berlin offices, he arranged for her to be flown to Berlin regularly so that he could spend time with her. He made daily telephone calls when she was at home and sent weekly letters when she was away, maintaining a constancy of contact that spoke to genuine paternal affection. He referred to her by the childhood nickname Pupi, which means something like doll or puppet in German, and he included her in some of his official functions, giving her a window into the world of power and ceremony that defined her father's existence. This closeness to Heinrich Himmler would define the entire arc of Gudrun's subsequent life. When Allied forces captured her and her mother in the immediate aftermath of Germany's defeat, they were processed through a series of internment camps in Italy, France, and Germany. The same circuit of detention facilities that housed many of the family members and associates of senior Nazi officials. Both Gudrun and her mother were summoned to Nuremberg to provide testimony at the trials that were beginning to lay out the full documented horror of what the Nazi regime had done. They were subsequently released in November 1946 after their testimony was taken. For most Germans of her generation, this release marked the beginning of a process of reorientation, a coming to terms with the catastrophe of Nazi Germany and the moral reckoning it demanded. Gudrun took no such path. Instead, Gudrun Himmler spent the subsequent decades of her life working with determined energy to preserve her father's image and memory in as positive a light as she could. She became one of the central figures within the Stille Hilfe organization, the same network that Ilse Hess also supported, which provided financial assistance, legal support, and practical help to former SS members who were imprisoned, facing charges, or hiding from justice. The organization was a form of organized Nazi-era survivor network, and Gudrun's involvement with it, which continued for decades and was well documented by German intelligence services, was a testament to the depth of her commitment to her father's world. She contested the widely accepted account of her father's death, refusing to accept the established historical consensus that Heinrich Himmler committed suicide by biting into a concealed cyanide capsule when he was captured by British forces in May 1945. Instead, she insisted to the end of her life that her father had been assassinated, a position that placed her in the company of conspiracy theorists and former Nazis who found psychological relief in denying the evidence of Heinrich's self-chosen death. Gudrun Himmler died in 2018, having lived for 89 years and having spent virtually the entire span of her adult life defending the legacy of one of history's most prolific mass murderers. The story of Martin Bormann Jr. stands in instructive contrast to Gudrun Himmler's, offering a very different model of how a child of the Nazi elite could choose to engage with an unbearable inheritance. Martin Bormann Jr. was born on April 14, 1930. the eldest son of Martin Bormann Sr., who served as head of the Nazi Party Chancellery and became Hitler's closest personal aide in the final years of the war. Young Martin's childhood was shaped by his father's extraordinary proximity to power, and he grew up in an environment where the highest figures of the Nazi state were simply the adults his family associated with. He was sheltered, at least initially, from the grotesque reality of what that world was producing in concentration camps and on that Eastern Front. He was just a boy during the years when his father was wielding near absolute power within the Nazi bureaucracy, and the end of the war found him an adolescent confronted suddenly with revelations about what his father's world had actually meant for millions of innocent people. What Martin Bormann Jr. did with this revelation is what makes his story remarkable. The confrontation with his father's crimes led him not to denial or evasion, but to a profound personal transformation. He converted to Catholicism and, going further than a simple change of religious identity, he devoted his adult life to the church and to missionary work in some of the most challenging environments on earth. He worked in the mission fields of both the Congo and Cameroon, spending years in African communities far from the comfortable European world he had been born into, driven by what appears to have been a genuine desire to do something constructive with his life in counterweight to what his father had done with his. The conversion and the missionary work represented, for Martin Jr., a form of moral restitution that was personal and practical rather than merely rhetorical. But his story does not end with this redemptive narrative. In 2011, many decades after his years as a missionary, Martin Bormann Jr. found himself at the center of deeply troubling abuse allegations. A former student came forward claiming that Bormann had subjected him to sexual abuse when he was 12 years old in the early 1960s, during Bormann's time working with young people through the church. Other accusers emerged with allegations of severe physical violence against students in his care. The allegations cast a long shadow over the narrative of redemption that had been associated with Martin Bormann Jr.'s post-war choices. By the time these accusations surfaced, Bormann was suffering from dementia, a condition that left him either unable or unwilling to respond to the charges against him. No legal action was ever taken, but the independent Klasnik Commission, the body established to investigate abuses within the Catholic Church in Austria, examined the case and awarded compensation to one of his accusers. Martin Bormann Jr. died in 2013, leaving behind a biographical arc that moved from the shadow of his father's crimes through what appeared to be genuine redemption and service to a dark final chapter of its own. His life resists simple categorization, much like the stories of so many who were born into the wreckage of the Nazi era. Niklas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, who served as Hitler's personal lawyer, and then as Governor General of occupied Poland, has taken perhaps the most aggressively public approach to confronting his father's legacy of any child of the Nazi elite. Born in 1939, Niklas was far too young during the war years to understand what was happening around him, but the adult world he grew up into was one saturated with the documented evidence of what Hans Frank had done. Hans Frank was known as the Butcher of Poland, a title that reflected the savage totality of the repression he oversaw in occupied Polish territory. As Governor General, he administered a region where millions of Jewish people were rounded up and sent to death camps, where Polish intellectuals and professionals were systematically murdered in an attempt to decapitate Polish society, and where the ordinary civilian population was subjected to a brutality of occupation that was designed to reduce them permanently to a subject people. Hans Frank was one of the most culpable figures tried at Nuremberg, and he was sentenced to death and executed by hanging on October 16, 1946. He was one of the few senior Nazi officials who appeared to experience something like genuine religious remorse before his execution, having reconverted to Catholicism in prison and making statements that acknowledged the magnitude of his crimes. Niklas Frank, growing up in the shadow of this history, made the decision to confront it with unusual directness and even ferocity. He has written several books examining his father's life and crimes, including the memoir In the Shadow of the Reich, which offered a painfully candid examination of what it means to be the child of a man who committed crimes on such a vast scale. What makes Niklas Frank particularly notable among the children of Nazi leaders is the vehemence of his denunciation of his father, which goes beyond the measured language of historical acknowledgement into something that reads at times as genuine rage. In public appearances and lectures at schools and Universities across Germany and beyond, Niklas Frank has been blunt about his judgment of his father, refusing to soften the verdict or to find any thread of personal or familial loyalty that could mitigate it. His commitment to educating younger generations about the Holocaust and about the human mechanisms that produced it has made him a significant voice in German historical culture, even as some critics have questioned whether his approach, which can veer into sensationalism, always serves the goal of genuine historical understanding. That said, his willingness to stand in front of audiences and say without equivocation that his father was a mass murderer who deserved to die represents a form of moral courage that was far from universal among the children of the Nazi elite. Edda Göring, the only child of Hermann Göring and his actress wife Emmy Sonnemann, chose a path of almost complete public silence that stood in stark contrast to figures like Niklas Frank. She was born on Taubitz, June 2, 1938, just before the eruption of the war, and her early years were lived in the extraordinary material luxury of the Göring family's existence at their Karinhall estate north of Berlin. The estate was a monument to looted wealth, stocked with stolen artworks and furnished with items confiscated from Jewish families and other victims of the regime's theft on an industrial scale. Little Edda knew nothing of the origins of this luxury. She was photographed regularly at public events, presented as a symbol of the wholesome family life that Nazi propaganda wished to project, alongside the imagery of military power and racial ideology. She was the recipient of numerous historic artworks during her childhood, including a precious Madonna and child painting by the Renaissance master Lucas Cranach the Elder, a piece that had presumably been stolen from its original owner as part of the systematic cultural plunder that Göring conducted throughout the occupied territories. As the war turned against Germany and the Allied bombing campaign began reducing German cities to rubble, Edda and her mother relocated to their mountain residence at Obersalzberg near Berchtesgaden, the same area where Hitler had his Berghof retreat, seeking safety in the relative physical remoteness of the Alps. The end of the war brought an almost total reversal of Edda's material circumstances. Her father was among the most prominent defendants at the Nuremberg trials, facing charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. But Hermann Göring was not going to give his enemies the satisfaction of a public execution. On the night of October 15, 1946, the evening before he was scheduled to be hanged, he swallowed a concealed cyanide capsule and died in his cell, depriving the Nuremberg proceedings of their most theatrically self-important defendant. His death left Edda with what she would later describe as a complicated legacy that she spent much of her life trying to understand. Edda Göring chose to live as privately as possible in the decades after the war. She rarely spoke about her father in public, maintaining a wall of silence that stood in contrast to the often turbulent public discussions conducted by children of other senior Nazis. In private conversations, however, those who knew her reported that she maintained throughout her life that her father had been, on a personal level, a good man, a position that inevitably collided with the historical documentation of his crimes. In the 1950s and 1960s, she became embroiled in prolonged legal disputes over the valuable artworks and gifts she had received as a child, including the Cranach painting. These disputes ended badly for Edda, with most of the cases decided against her in 1968, and the artworks that had decorated her childhood returning to the custody of institutions or claimants who could establish clearer legitimate title. In 1986, during a television interview broadcast in Sweden, Edda broke her characteristic public silence to express deep affection for both of her parents, a statement that generated a predictable response given the historical record associated with her father's name. Edda Göring died in 2018, the same year as Gudrun Himmler, both women having lived into their 80s with the names of mass murderers, permanently attached to their own identities. She was 80 years old. Rolf Mengele carries perhaps the most agonizing of all the inheritances borne by the children of the Nazi era, the name and biological legacy of Josef Mengele, the SS physician at Auschwitz concentration camp whose medical experiments on prisoners, particularly twins, made him one of the most universally recognized symbols of Nazi evil. Rolf was born on March 16, 1944, in the final phase of the war, and he spent his early childhood in Germany while his father was committing the crimes at Auschwitz that would define his historical reputation. The SS physician known as the Angel of Death was conducting his grotesque experiments throughout 1943 and 1944, selecting prisoners from the arriving transports, conducting his pseudo-scientific procedures on living human subjects, and overseeing the process by which hundreds of thousands of people were directed to the gas chambers. Rolf knew none of this during his early years. His childhood was instead shaped by a carefully constructed lie. He was raised to believe that his father had been a German war hero, a good man who had served his country faithfully and who had been unfairly branded a criminal by the post-war order. Rolf Mengele fled Germany after the war and made his way to South America, first to Argentina and then to Paraguay and Brazil, using the rat lines that helped former SS members escape justice. He never returned to Germany and never faced legal accountability for his crimes. His escape was one of the most significant failures of the post-war justice system, and it was a failure that depended in part on the silence of people who knew his whereabouts, including his own family. Rolf grew up in Germany, knowing only that his father was absent, and that the reasons for this absence were somehow connected to the politics of the post-war world. The truth came to Rolf as a young teenager, and the revelation was, by any measure, one of the most devastating moments a young person could face. Learning as an adolescent that the man you had been taught to revere as a hero was in fact one of history's most notorious war criminals is the kind of biographical fact that could shatter a sense of self entirely. Rolf reacted by trying to build a life that was as far removed from his father's as possible. He studied law and built a career as a corporate attorney, a conventional professional life that placed him at maximum distance from the world of his father's crimes. But the connection was never entirely severable. Rolf Mengele, hiding in South America, maintained contact with his son through letters, and this correspondence sparked a complicated pull toward direct confrontation that Rolf eventually could not resist. In 1977, Rolf travelled to South America to meet his father in person. What he found when he arrived was a man who displayed no remorse whatsoever for what he had done at Auschwitz, who instead attempted to rationalize and justify his experiments and his role in the death camp system. Rolf was appalled. He despised his father and everything his father represented. But despite this disgust, when the moment of decision came, Rolf could not bring himself to betray his father to the Nazi hunters who were actively searching for Mengele. He kept silent about his father's location, and as a direct consequence of this silence, Rolf Mengele lived out his remaining years in South America, dying in Brazil in 1979 when he suffered a stroke while swimming and drowned, having evaded justice for the entirety of his post-war life. Rolf's decision not to expose his father has been the subject of considerable moral debate. He has spoken about it since, explaining the impossibility of the choice he faced, the impossibility of being the person who turns his own father over to a justice system that would have resulted in his execution. After his visit to South America, Rolf altered his surname and effectively disappeared into private life. According to what has been pieced together from limited public information, he is believed to have lived as a family man in Germany, working as an attorney under his changed name until his retirement. The full details of his subsequent life have never been made entirely public, and Rolf has maintained the kind of privacy that his extraordinary circumstances seem to have demanded. Wolf Rüdiger Hess, the son of Rudolf Hess and Ilse Prühl, grew up with a father who was physically absent for virtually his entire life, and yet whose shadow fell over everything he did. Wolf was born in 1937, 4 years before his father's dramatic solo flight to Scotland in 1941, that led to his capture by the British and his eventual imprisonment for life. Rudolf Hess was held in British captivity throughout the rest of the war and was then transferred to Spandau Prison in West Berlin after being sentenced at Nuremberg in 1946. Wolf grew up visiting his father in prison, a childhood experience that would have been almost surreally abnormal. Seeing his father through prison glass, interacting with him under the supervision of Allied guards, building a relationship with a man who was simultaneously the most important figure in his personal universe and a prisoner of the wartime Allies. Rudolf Hess had held the position of Deputy Führer to Adolf Hitler from 1933 until his Scottish flight in 1941, making him one of the most senior figures in the Nazi hierarchy, and his fate after the war was both more merciful in some ways and more prolonged in its suffering than that of many of his contemporaries who were executed at Nuremberg. Rather than accepting the historical judgment that his father was a war criminal who had spent his life in service of a murderous ideology, Wolf Hess dedicated himself from an early age to rehabilitating Rudolf's reputation. He campaigned relentlessly and with enormous organizational energy for his father's release from Spandau, establishing in the 1950s an organization called the Committee to Free Rudolf Hess that eventually attracted several 100,000 supporters, including individuals with some political standing within West German society. The campaign was built around the argument that Rudolf Hess's continued imprisonment was unjust, that he had been a man of peace who had risked his life to end the war, and that keeping a very old man in solitary confinement decades after the conflict had ended served no legitimate purpose. Some of these arguments were not without a certain humanitarian resonance, even among people who had no sympathy for the Nazi ideology that Rudolf Hess had served. The spectacle of an increasingly frail and elderly man being kept behind the walls of Spandau, primarily because the Soviet Union refused to agree to his release, did strike many observers as a strange and disproportionate extension of wartime justice. Wolf authored numerous books advocating for his father's recognition as a German hero rather than a criminal, positioning Rudolf's flight to Scotland as an act of visionary courage that deserved admiration rather than the derision and official disavowal it had received from both the Nazi regime and the Allied powers. The books found readers in right-wing circles and among those who maintained sympathy for the legacy of the Third Reich, but they were not received as serious historical scholarship. Wolf Hess's lifelong project of rehabilitating his father came to a bitter end on August 17, 1987, when Rudolf Hess was found dead in Spandau prison, officially having hanged himself with an electrical cord in the garden house of the prison grounds. He was 93 years old and had been the sole prisoner in Spandau for many years by this point. Wolf immediately rejected the suicide verdict, claiming that his father had been murdered by the British authorities who oversaw his custody, a claim that was passionately held but never substantiated by the subsequent investigations that were conducted. The controversy over how Rudolf Hess died became another cause that Wolf took up with the same combative energy he had brought to the campaign for his release. Wolf Rüdiger Hess died in 2001, having spent his entire adult life in service of his father's memory, never wavering from his conviction that Rudolf Hess was a misunderstood patriot rather than a war criminal. Albert Speer Jr., born on July 29, 1934 in Berlin, offers one of the most quietly compelling examples of a child of the Nazi elite who found a way to engage with his inheritance without either defending it or making it the defining public dimension of his identity. Albert was born just days before Hitler officially assumed the combined powers of president and chancellor and declared himself Führer, and his earliest years were spent in Berchtesgaden, the Bavarian alpine village that served as the location of Hitler's Berghof retreat. There are extraordinary pieces of film footage from the 1930s that show a young Albert Speer Jr. playing on the porch of Hitler's villa under the watchful gaze of the Führer himself, images that capture with peculiar intimacy the proximity of these children to the centre of absolute power. Albert Speer Sr. was Hitler's primary architect, the man who designed the monumental Nazi buildings and stage sets that gave the regime its particular visual language of overwhelming domination, and who later served as armaments minister, deploying his organizational genius in service of the war machine at a cost to millions of forced laborers who worked under brutal conditions. Albert Speer Sr. was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment, which he served in full at Spandau prison, being released in 1966. He was unusual among the convicted Nazi leadership in the apparent genuineness of the remorse he expressed for his role in the regime. Whether this remorse was truly sincere or was itself a strategic performance designed to distinguish him from the other defendants and save his life has been debated by historians ever since, particularly since later research suggested that Speer had more direct knowledge of the Holocaust than he admitted during his trial. Regardless of the authenticity of his repentance, Albert Speer Sr. became the Nazi official who expressed regret, a unique and historically significant figure in the landscape of post-war German accountability. His son, Albert Jr., grew up in the aftermath of this conviction. When his father went to prison, the Speer family took refuge with Albert Jr.'s grandparents in Heidelberg, a university city in southwest Germany that became his home during the years of his father's imprisonment. The experience of his father's incarceration and the weight of his family's association with one of history's most condemned regimes had visible effects on Albert Jr. He developed a severe stutter during this period, a physical manifestation of the psychological pressures he was living under, a stutter that he worked hard to overcome and eventually managed to control. He initially trained as a carpenter, a manual trade as far from the grand architectural ambitions of his father as one could imagine within the same broad category of building and making. He later shifted his focus to architecture itself, returning to the discipline that had defined his father's career and built a successful professional practice as an architect. Albert Speer Jr. was consistently adamant throughout his life that his choice of architecture as a profession was not influenced by his father and was not an act of homage to him. In an interview published in the Süddeutsche Zeitung in 2010, he spoke with characteristic reticence about his relationship to his father's legacy, making clear that he had worked throughout his life to separate himself from his father's identity, and that this separation was something he had pursued with deliberate effort. His father, Albert Speer Sr., died in 1981, having spent his post-prison years writing his memoirs and giving interviews that maintained the carefully constructed narrative of the repentant Nazi. Albert Speer Jr. died at his Frankfurt residence on September 15, 2017, at the age of 83, having built a professional life that stood on its own terms rather than being defined primarily by the dark heritage of his family name. Now we move to figures whose stories have received less public attention but which illuminate equally important dimensions of the question of what happened to the families of the Nazi elite. The children of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp, represent a particularly dramatic case because their father was not merely a senior Nazi official, but the man directly responsible for administering the largest and most lethal killing facility in human history. Rudolf Höss commanded Auschwitz from 1940 to 1943, and again briefly in 1944, overseeing the murder of an estimated 1.1 million people, the majority of whom were Jewish. He was captured after the war, tried and hanged at Auschwitz itself on April 16, 1947, a piece of rough historical symmetry. His wife Hedwig and their 5 children had lived on the grounds of the Auschwitz complex during his tenure there, in a comfortable house literally separated from the gas chambers by a wall. Hedwig Höss tended her garden while death on an industrial scale took place within sight and smell of her domestic life. The children of Rudolf Höss have had to navigate this almost unimaginably difficult inheritance. Hans-Jürgen Höss, one of Rudolf's sons, has spoken in later life about the impossible psychological complexity of growing up as he did, understanding eventually that the pleasant family home of his childhood had been located at the centre of mass murder. In interviews, he has described visiting Auschwitz as an adult and standing in the spaces where he had played as a child, trying to reconcile those sensory memories with the documented horror of what had happened there. His sister Brigitte Höss emigrated to the United States, where she built a life in Virginia, working as a seamstress, and was the subject of a documentary film called I Was a Perpetrator's Child that examined how children of senior Nazi officials dealt with their identities across the decades of their adult lives. The process of coming to terms with being born into such a family, the documentary made clear, was not a single moment of revelation, but a lifetime of ongoing psychological work that never fully resolved itself into peace or clarity. The case of the Goebbels family stands apart from all others in the most brutal possible way, because the post-war fate of Joseph Goebbels' children was not something they experienced at all. Joseph Goebbels served throughout the Nazi era as Reich Minister of Propaganda, the architect of the regime's control over information, culture, and public opinion, a man of extraordinary intelligence applied entirely in service of evil. He and his wife Magda had 6 children together, and these children, named Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig, and Heidrun, ranging in age from 12 to 4 years old at the time of Germany's defeat, were murdered by their own parents in the Berlin bunker complex on May 1, 1945, the day after Hitler's suicide. Magda Goebbels, who had been described by some as the ideal of the Nazi woman, administered sedatives to each of the 6 children to render them unconscious, and then personally poisoned each of them with cyanide. Joseph Goebbels then shot himself and Magda, and their bodies were burned in the Reich Chancellery garden in a scene that mirrored what had been done with Hitler's body the previous day. The murder of these 6 children by their own mother is one of the most disturbing single acts of the entire Nazi era, and it has been the subject of considerable historical and psychological analysis in the decades since. Magda Goebbels left behind a letter explaining that she could not imagine her children living in a world without National Socialism, and that she preferred to kill them rather than allow them to grow up in the post-Nazi Germany that she knew was coming. It was an act that combined maternal love in its most grotesquely twisted form with the ideological fanaticism that had consumed the entire Nazi enterprise. The only one of the Goebbels children who survived was Harold Quandt, Magda's son from her first marriage, who was serving in the German military and was not in the bunker at the time. Harold Quandt spent time as a prisoner of war and was eventually released. He went on to become a successful businessman in West Germany, building a significant business empire in the post-war economic recovery, and died in a plane crash in 1967. The story of Herta Schneider, who was Eva Braun's closest childhood friend and remained so throughout the war, offers yet another angle on the world of women connected to the Nazi elite, even without formal institutional roles. Herta married Gruppenführer Georg Schneider, and she and Eva maintained their friendship throughout the war years, with Herta being one of the few civilians who was a regular presence at the Berghof and in the private social world that surrounded Hitler. After Germany's defeat and Eva's death by suicide alongside Hitler in the Berlin bunker, Herta faced the complications of her close personal association with the most notorious couple in history, though her lack of any official role protected her from the most serious legal consequences. What is perhaps most striking about examining all of these lives together is the sheer variety of responses to the same basic situation, the situation of being born into or married into one of the most criminal enterprises in human history, and then having to live in the ruins of that enterprise for the rest of one's days. Some chose denial, maintaining to their deaths that the men they had loved were misunderstood rather than monstrous. Some chose a kind of organizational continuity, working through networks like Stille Hilfe to preserve the practical infrastructure of the Nazi Old Boys network even in the post-war world. Some chose to confront the truth head-on, as Niklas Frank did, with a ferocity that was almost violent in its directness. Some, like Rolf Mengele, found themselves paralyzed between their moral knowledge and the irreducible pull of filial connection, unable to do the thing their conscience told them was right, and some simply tried to disappear, changing their names and their circumstances and building new identities as far as possible from the catastrophe their families had helped create. The question of whether the wives in particular bear moral responsibility for what their husbands did has never been satisfactorily resolved by either the legal systems that processed them or by historical scholarship. The denazification proceedings that examined most of them tended to treat them as secondary figures, women whose influence and agency were necessarily limited by the patriarchal structures of Nazi society itself. But this view seems in many cases too generous. Women like Lina Heydrich actively contributed to their husbands' careers and their husbands' power. Women like Margarete Himmler were present in the occupied territories and recorded in their own diaries the racial contempt that informed the regime's murderous policies. Women like Emmy Goering lived in stolen luxury without apparent discomfort. The legal frameworks of the immediate post-war era were ill-equipped to grapple with this kind of diffuse but real complicity, and the sentences most of them received were minimal by any reasonable standard of proportionality. Another figure whose post-war story deserves examination is Henriette Heydrich, the daughter of Reinhard Heydrich and Lina, who grew up in the Bohemian estate that Hitler had given to the family and who later had to navigate the weight of being the daughter of one of the most feared men in the Third Reich. She lived a relatively private life after the war, far from the public advocacy of figures like Gudrun Himmler or Ulse Hess, though the shadow of her father's name was inescapable. Similarly, the various children of Goering from his first marriage and other relationships found themselves navigating the aftermath of their father's extraordinary rise and fall. Goering's daughter from his first wife, Karin, who died in 1931, was not from Emmy and therefore had a different relationship to the post-war family dynamic. The children of the Nazi elite, who chose the path of public engagement with their inheritance, have collectively become an important element of German historical culture, a living embodiment of the question of intergenerational responsibility. Germany's broader process of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which translates roughly as coming to terms with the past, has been one of the most sustained and self-critical national reckonings with historical atrocity that any country has ever undertaken. The willingness of figures like Niklas Frank to stand in classrooms and tell students directly about what his father did and to condemn it without equivocation is part of this larger cultural process, and it represents something genuinely unusual in world history. Most nations that have committed atrocities have found ways to avoid this kind of sustained self-examination. Germany's relative success at maintaining it, imperfect and contested as it has always been, is in part the product of individuals who have chosen the path of confrontation over the path of silence. But it would be wrong to leave the impression that the path of confrontation was the dominant choice among the children and families of the Nazi elite. It was not. More common by far was the path of varying degrees of silence, evasion, and gradual assimilation into the ordinary fabric of post-war German life. The surnames changed, the family stories got quietly edited, and the connections to the Third Reich became things whispered about rather than publicly acknowledged. Some families moved to regions of Germany where they were not known and established new social networks that had no connection to their wartime history. Others remained in their home regions but discovered that the social silence of their neighbours and acquaintances offered a sufficient shield of anonymity, particularly as the immediate post-war years gave way to the 1950s and the extraordinary economic recovery of the Federal Republic, which gave West Germans a new identity built around prosperity and democratic reconstruction, rather than the ruins of the Nazi era. The case of Ingeborg Weber, the wife of Karl Dönitz, Germany's last Führer and the man who served as Grand Admiral of the Navy before succeeding Hitler as head of state in the final days of April 1945, illustrates how even the most prominent post-war figures could construct lives of relative obscurity. Karl Dönitz was tried at Nuremberg and convicted of war crimes, sentenced to 10 years imprisonment at Spandau. Unlike the other Nazi leaders who shared that prison, Dönitz was released in 1956 after serving his full sentence, and he went on to live for another 25 years, dying in 1980, making him one of the longest-lived of the senior Nazi military figures. His wife Ingeborg had died during the war in 1962, and their family, life had been marked by the deaths of both of their sons during combat, a personal tragedy that touched even those who held Dönitz himself in contempt for his role in the U-boat campaign that caused enormous civilian suffering among the crews of Allied merchant vessels. Dönitz himself remained entirely unrepentant about his role in the war, defending his conduct and his loyalty to Hitler until the end of his life, and writing memoirs that were viewed by most serious historians as self-serving revisionism rather than honest historical engagement. The story of Brunhilde Pomsel, who served as Goebbels' secretary for the final years of the war and who became a minor figure of historical controversy when she was interviewed extensively in her late 90s for a documentary film, illustrates a different kind of post-war life. Pomsel was not a wife or daughter, but rather a professional associate of one of the most powerful men in the regime, and her decades of silence followed by her. Late-life interviews provided an extraordinary window into how ordinary Germans who had worked within the Nazi apparatus constructed their post-war identities around the concept of personal ignorance and limited responsibility. She died in 2017 at the age of 106, one of the last direct witnesses to the inner workings of the Nazi propaganda machine. Perhaps the most striking post-war development involving the descendants of the Nazi elite was the decision by several of them to undergo voluntary sterilization in order to ensure that the bloodlines associated with Nazi leadership would end with their generation. Bettina Göring, a grandniece of Hermann Göring and Stefan Röhrl, who was connected to the Nazi leadership through his own family, were among those who made this extraordinary and deeply personal decision. Bettina Göring, who emigrated to New Mexico in the United States, spoke openly about her choice in interviews, explaining that she could not bear the idea of passing on the genetic heritage associated with a man like Hermann Göring. She had herself sterilized as a young woman and has explained this decision in terms of a deliberate choice to break the biological continuity of a family line she associated with monstrousness. Whether one views this decision as a form of courage or as an overcorrection driven by psychological pain inflicted by guilt by association, it represents one of the most extreme responses to the question of what children and grandchildren of the Nazi elite owe to history. The grandchildren of the Nazi elite, those born in the 1950s and 1960s, to the children who themselves had grown up in the shadow of the Third Reich, have faced a different set of challenges. For them, the Nazi connections were mediated through an additional generational layer, but they were no less real as family history and no less psychologically complex. Kathrin Himmler, a grandniece of Heinrich Himmler, published in 2007 a book titled The Himmler Brothers, which examined the role of her family in the Nazi regime with considerable historical seriousness and personal honesty. Her willingness to excavate her own family's history and present it to the public as a contribution to historical understanding represents a form of the Vergangenheitsbewältigung that has been part of German public life for decades, extended now into the third generation after the Nazi era. Returning now to some of the wives who have not yet received the detailed attention they deserve, we must consider the case of Louise Funk, the wife of Walter Funk, who served as Reich Minister of Economics and as President of the Reichsbank. Walter Funk was deeply implicated in the financial machinery of the Holocaust, as the Reichsbank under his leadership received and processed the personal property of Holocaust victims, including gold teeth extracted from the bodies of murdered Jews, a fact that was documented with devastating clarity at the Nuremberg trials. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, though he was released early in 1957 due to serious illness and died 2 years later in 1960. Louise Funk spent the post-war years navigating the practical difficulties of her husband's imprisonment and the social stigma of his conviction, a situation shared by many of the wives of convicted Nazi officials who had to rebuild their material circumstances without either the income their husbands had previously provided or the social status that had come with proximity to the Nazi hierarchy. The story of Anneliese Speer, Albert Speer Sr.'s wife, who remained married to him throughout his 20 years of imprisonment at Spandau and who built a life around the eventual prospect of his release, offers another variation on the pattern of wifely loyalty to imprisoned Nazi officials. Unlike Ilse Hess, who devoted her loyalty to a husband who was never released, Anneliese did eventually see Albert Speer come home when he walked free from Spandau in October 1966. The Speers' children had by this point grown into adults who had built their own professional lives, in Albert Jr.'s case as an architect, and in the case of his siblings in various other directions that the available historical record does not always illuminate clearly. Albert Speer Sr. spent his remaining years writing his memoirs and giving interviews, and Anneliese remained by his side until his death in 1981. The degree to which she shared his carefully constructed self-presentation as the Nazi who didn't know about the Holocaust is something that historians have found difficult to fully assess, as Anneliese herself did not leave an extensive public record of her private views. What happened to the physical property, the estates and mansions and artworks and bank accounts that the Nazi elite had accumulated through theft, political corruption, and the exploitation of a regime that placed their personal enrichment above the lives of millions, is itself a story that intersects with the post-war lives of the wives and children. Allied denazification laws provided for the confiscation of property identified as having been acquired through Nazi criminality, and in the immediate post-war period there were significant seizures. But the practical implementation of these laws was imperfect and often politically complicated. Some property was returned to surviving owners or their heirs, some was retained by state agencies, and some remained in the hands of wives and family members who managed to establish through legal proceedings that they had personal claims independent of their husband's criminal activities. Emmy Goering's experience of having 30% of her remaining wealth seized while keeping the rest illustrates the kind of partial accountability that was typical of the denazification era. The artworks are a particularly complicated element of this story. Hermann Göring had assembled during the war years one of the largest personal art collections in Europe, systematically looting the museums and private collections of occupied countries for items that suited his grandiose self-image as a Renaissance prince of the modern era. Much of this collection was recovered after the war by the Monument Men, the Allied cultural officers tasked with finding and repatriating stolen cultural property, and pieces were returned to their countries of origin or, where specific owners could be identified, to the original Jewish families from whom they had been stolen. But not all of it was recovered, and the fate of some pieces, including items that may have remained in the possession of the Göring family or been dispersed through wartime chaos, has been the subject of ongoing research and legal proceedings decades after the war's end. The restitution of looted artworks remains one of the most active areas of post-war justice, with new claims being filed and new discoveries being made decades into the 21st century. The 2013 discovery in a Munich apartment of over 1,000 works of art, the Gurlitt collection, that had been acquired during the Nazi era, brought the question of stolen cultural property back into the headlines and reminded the world that the process of restitution begun in 1945 is still far from complete. These pieces of the larger story connect directly to the families of the Nazi elite through the mechanisms of inheritance and property transmission, as artworks acquired illegally by senior Nazis could in theory have been passed down through family lines and might be sitting today in the collections of their descendants. The question of how the children and grandchildren of the Nazi elite have engaged with the Holocaust education programs that became central to German public life from the 1960s onward is one that produces varied answers. Some, like Niklas Frank, have been active participants in these programs, speaking at schools and conferences. Others have avoided any public engagement whatsoever. A few have found intermediate positions, acknowledging the crimes of their fathers in private contexts while avoiding the kind of sustained public advocacy that figures like Frank have undertaken. The German state has been generally supportive of educational initiatives that bring the children of perpetrators into schools to speak about their experiences, recognizing that this kind of testimony carries a particular weight and authority that professional historians cannot fully replicate. The descendants of the Nazi elite who live today, many of whom are now in their 60s, 70s and 80s, carry with them a burden that does not diminish simply with the passage of time. Every generation of any family with this kind of history faces the same fundamental question at some point in their lives, which is how to relate to what came before them and what obligations, if any, they carry as a result of their family membership. The answer that each individual has chosen tells us something important not just about those individuals, but about the larger human mechanisms of memory, conscience, and moral reckoning. The story of Klaus Barbie's family in some ways parallels the stories of the children we have examined, though Barbie was not himself one of the highest-ranking Nazi officials. Klaus Barbie served as the head of the Gestapo in Lyon, France, and was known as the Butcher of Lyon for the torture and deportations of Jews and resistance members that he oversaw. After the war, he escaped to Bolivia, where he was eventually located by Nazi hunters. He was extradited to France in 1983 and convicted of crimes against humanity in 1987, dying in prison in 1991. His children, particularly his daughter Ute Messner and son-in-law Klaus Barbie Jr., faced the extraordinary experience of seeing their father publicly tried and convicted in their adult years, rather than in the immediate post-war chaos when most such judgments were delivered. Ute Messner maintained a public defense of her father that drew considerable criticism from French Jewish organizations and from the survivors and families of his victims. Her insistence on her father's humanity in the face of the documented evidence of his crimes mirrored the responses of many of the wives and children we have examined, the apparently irresistible pull of personal loyalty over historical judgment. One of the most revealing aspects of studying these lives in aggregate is what they tell us about the relationship between ideology, personal loyalty, and moral perception. The Nazi women and their children who remained loyal to the men in their lives did not, for the most part, appear to believe themselves to be defending evil. They believed with varying degrees of self-awareness that the men they loved had been fundamentally decent human beings who had served their country faithfully, who had perhaps made mistakes or acted in ways that history had judged too harshly, but who were not the monsters the post-war world insisted they were. This psychological reality does not excuse any of them, but it does illuminate something important about how atrocity is enabled by ordinary human capacities for love, loyalty, and self-deception. The wives of the Nazi elite loved their husbands. The children of the Nazi elite loved their fathers. These were, in the ordinary human sense, real relationships with genuine emotional content. The tragedy is that those genuine emotions were placed in service of people who had committed extraordinary crimes, and that the love and loyalty that ordinary human beings show to the people closest to them can become, in extreme circumstances, a mechanism for the perpetuation of injustice and the obstruction of accountability. The post-war fate of Magda Goebbels' sister-in-law and extended family illustrates yet another dimension of this world. Magda had brought to her marriage with Josef Goebbels a stepson, Harold Quandt, from her first marriage, and Harold's subsequent career as a successful West German industrialist placed him at the intersection of the Nazi family world and the rapidly reconstructing capitalism of the Federal Republic. The story of West German business in the 1950s and 1960s is in some ways inseparable from the story of men and families who had benefited from and participated in the Nazi regime, and who transferred those connections and resources into the post-war economy with varying degrees of accountability. The Quandt family, one of Germany's most prominent industrial dynasties, has been the subject of historical investigations that have examined the family's use of forced labor during the Nazi era, a fact that the family for many years preferred not to discuss publicly, but which became unavoidable as scholars documented it with increasing precision. The stories of these women and children are united by their extraordinary circumstances, but divided by their extraordinary variety of responses to those circumstances. No single template fits all of them. The loyal wife and the divorcing wife, the defending child and the denouncing child, the private survivor and the public advocate, all of these represent genuine human responses to a situation that had no precedent and that offered no straightforward path to any form of resolution. What we can say, looking across all of these lives, is that the question of accountability did not end with the Nuremberg verdicts of 1945 and 1946. It continued to be worked out in the small decisions and large choices that the wives and children of the Nazi elite made in the years and decades that followed, and it continues to be worked out today in the decisions their descendants make about what to acknowledge, what to remember, and what kind of relationship to maintain with a history that will not allow itself to be forgotten. The post-war trials that address the crimes of specific Nazi wives are worth examining in more detail for what they reveal about the limitations of post-war justice as applied to women within the Nazi hierarchy. The Nuremberg trials were structured to address the crimes of the men who had built and operated the machinery of the Nazi state, and the legal frameworks they applied were primarily designed with male defendants in mind. Women appeared at the trials almost exclusively as witnesses rather than defendants, and even those with documented evidence of direct participation in crimes frequently escaped serious legal consequences. The denazification proceedings that operated across the Allied occupation zones were similarly oriented primarily toward male former Nazis, treating the women in their lives as secondary figures whose culpability was measured almost entirely in terms of their relationship to their husbands. This structural limitation of post-war justice meant that women like Lina Heydrich, who had lived on a Bohemian estate staffed by forced labourers and who had been credibly alleged to have personally abused those labourers, could walk away from the denazification process with her legal record entirely clear. It meant that Margarete Himmler, who had visited occupied Poland and recorded in her own diary the racial contempt that animated the regime's murderous policies, was judged only a minor profiteer and sentenced to 30 days of penal labour. It meant that Emmy Goering, who had lived for a decade in a palace of stolen wealth, received only a year in prison and the confiscation of a third of what remained of her fortune. These outcomes were not aberrations but systematic patterns that reflected both the legal frameworks of the era and the broader cultural assumptions about women's agency and responsibility that prevailed in the mid-20th century. The question of whether more rigorous legal accountability for these women would have served justice better is one that historians have generally answered in the affirmative, while acknowledging the practical difficulties that more comprehensive prosecution would have entailed. The sheer number of women who were materially complicit in the Nazi enterprise, from senior wives to lower-level party functionaries, to ordinary German women who benefited from the forced labour of Jewish domestic servants and who wore coats made from confiscated furs, made comprehensive legal accountability practically impossible, even if the political will to pursue it had existed. What was possible was a more serious engagement with the cases of women at the very top of the Nazi social hierarchy. And the failure to achieve even that level of accountability represents one of the significant shortcomings of the post-war justice process. The families of the Nazi elite who survived into the 21st century have done so in a Germany that has become, however imperfectly and incompletely, one of the most serious and sustained national projects of historical self-examination that any country has ever undertaken. The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the network of documentation centers, the mandatory Holocaust education in schools, the legal prohibition of Holocaust denial, the sustained engagement by German courts with prosecutions of concentration camp guards and other Nazi-era perpetrators, even into the 2010s and 2020s, all of these represent a collective national project of remembrance and accountability that is without clear parallel in world history. The families of the Nazi elite who have lived and died within this evolving cultural landscape have been shaped by it, challenged by it, and in many cases have contributed to it, either positively through public engagement with historical education or negatively through their resistance to the reckoning it demands. Another figure whose story adds important texture to this account is that of Karl Dönitz's surviving family members, particularly in the context of his release from Spandau in 1956. When Dönitz walked free after serving his 10-year sentence, he was one of the most senior Nazi figures to be released from Allied custody, still alive and in good enough health to face a significant post-prison life. He settled in the small North German town of R&uuml, near Hamburg, and lived there for the next 2.5 decades until his death in December 1980. His post-prison life was marked by a steadfast refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing or to engage with the historical reckoning that the Nuremberg conviction was meant to represent. He wrote his memoirs, gave interviews to sympathetic journalists and researchers, and maintained to the end of his life that he had been a professional naval officer who had done his duty and that the submarine warfare he had directed had been conducted in accordance with the laws of war, a position that historians found difficult to sustain given the evidence of orders that resulted in the drowning of merchant sailors and civilian passengers without rescue. His family, including a surviving daughter, dealt with the particular combination of pride in the father's professional achievements and the shadow of the conviction, a combination that they navigated largely in private. We should also give proper attention to the story of Henriette Hoffmann, who became Henriette von Schirach through her marriage to Baldur von Schirach, and examine more carefully the arc of her post-divorce life. After divorcing Baldur while he was in Spandau, Henriette used her access to extraordinary historical memories and her unique position as the daughter of Hitler's personal photographer to construct a post-war identity as a witness to history. She had known Hitler personally from childhood, had attended his table and his gatherings countless times, and had seen the inner workings of the social world of the Nazi elite from a perspective that no historian could replicate. Her memoir, published in 1967, was widely read partly because of the intimate details it contained, about Hitler's private personality and social behaviour, the Hitler who received children and told jokes and appeared to enjoy the company of Emmy Goering and the other socialites of the inner circle. This portrait of Hitler's private social self was historically useful even as it was inevitably coloured by the lens of someone who had grown up loving and admiring the man before the full horror of what he had done became undeniable. Henriette von Schirach lived until 1992, and in her later years she was a figure of considerable controversy. Some German journalists and historians valued her as a first-hand witness to events and people that would otherwise be known only through documents and official records. Others were critical of what they perceived as her tendency to present the Nazi world in ways that emphasized its human dimensions without adequate attention to the criminality that permeated every level of it. The tension between these two perspectives reflects a broader debate about how to write and speak about the Nazi era in ways that are both historically accurate and morally adequate, a debate that has no clean resolution and that will continue for as long as historians engage with this period. The story of Ilse Koch, who was not technically among the top tier of Nazi wives but whose post-war fate has made her name enduringly infamous, deserves consideration in this broader survey. Ilse Koch was the wife of Karl Otto Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald concentration camp, and she herself served at the camp in an official capacity. She became known during and after the war by the nickname the Witch of Buchenwald, and she was accused of having collected human skin tattoos from murdered prisoners and of having ordered the murder of prisoners specifically for the purpose of obtaining their skin for personal use. The exact truth of these specific accusations has been debated by historians, and some of the most extreme charges against her may have been exaggerated or fabricated, but what is not in doubt is that she was present at Buchenwald throughout her husband's tenure, that she exercised real authority within the camp's social and administrative sphere, and that she was directly aware of the systematic murder being carried out under her husband's command. After the war, Ilse Koch was tried by an American military tribunal and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1947. This sentence was controversially reduced to 4 years by American occupation authorities in 1948, a decision that caused outrage in the United States and led to a congressional investigation. She was released in 1949, but a German court then tried her independently and convicted her of instigating murder, sentencing her to life imprisonment in 1951. She remained in a German prison for the rest of her life. She was reported to have given birth to a son while in American custody following her initial arrest, and the identity of the child's father was the subject of considerable speculation. She committed suicide in her prison cell in September 1967. Her case is significant in our larger account because it represents the relatively rare instance of a Nazi wife who was held to genuinely serious legal accountability in a way that more closely reflected the scale of the crimes she was connected to, and it stands in contrast to the minimal legal consequences faced by many of the more prominent wives we have discussed. One of the most striking geographical dimensions of the post-war story of Nazi families is the extent to which former Nazis and their families created new communities in specific regions that became informal gathering points for the unreconstructed right. Certain parts of Bavaria, particularly in the areas around Garmisch-Partenkirchen and the Alpine foothills, became associated with the post-war social networks of former Nazi officials, while areas of the Rhine Valley and the northern German coast also developed concentrations of individuals who had served the regime at senior levels. The social networks that wives like Ilse Hess and Lina Heydrich were part of after the war were not merely personal relationships, but embedded networks of mutual support and shared ideological commitment that persisted into the 1970s and beyond, and that provided a degree of social infrastructure for those who refused to accept the historical judgment of 1945. The relationship between the post-war German far right and the families of the Nazi elite is a dimension of this story that has been extensively documented by German domestic intelligence services and by academic researchers who have studied the networks of neo-Nazi organizations in post-war Germany. The organizations like Stille Hilfe that Gudrun Himmler and Ilse Hess were involved in were not merely charitable associations. They were ideological organizations that consciously worked to maintain the social and political networks of the old Nazi order in a new political environment where those views could not be expressed openly. The financial support they provided to imprisoned SS members was also a form of political solidarity, a message to those who might cooperate with prosecutors or denazification officials that they would be materially rewarded for their silence and penalized for cooperation. The relationship between the children of the Nazi elite who chose to become advocates for historical education, like Niklas Frank, and the broader landscape of Holocaust education in Germany is itself a complex subject. Frank has been criticized by some scholars for the sensationalist aspects of his approach, which has at times included displaying photographs of his father's execution during school presentations, an approach that some educators have questioned on pedagogical grounds. The question of how much shock and direct confrontation is appropriate in Holocaust education and how much may actually be counterproductive by overwhelming students' ability to engage with the material thoughtfully is one that practitioners in the field have debated extensively. What is not in question is the genuine commitment of figures like Frank to ensuring that the crimes of their father's generation are not minimized or forgotten, and the historical value of their willingness to speak from the position of family members of perpetrators. The story of the wives and children of the Nazi elite also intersects in interesting ways with the broader phenomenon of what has been called the second generation of Holocaust survivors, the children of Jewish survivors who also grew up with parents marked by unimaginable trauma and loss. The psychological research on second-generation survivors has documented the transmission of trauma across generations, the ways in which parents' experiences of the Holocaust shape the psychological landscapes of children who were not themselves survivors. This research provides a mirror image to the experiences of the children of perpetrators, illuminating the ways in which both groups were shaped by the same historical events and yet experienced them through entirely opposite lenses. Some scholars have brought these two groups together in dialogue, creating encounters between children of survivors and children of perpetrators that are intended to model the possibility of human connection across the gulf of what was done and what was suffered, following the model of the meeting between Monika Hertwig and Helen Jonas Rosenzweig that we discussed earlier. The remarkable and disturbing case of Gudrun Berwitz, as Gudrun Himmler was known after her marriage, deserves one final note in this account because of the extraordinary longevity of her ideological commitment. She was born in 1929 and died in 2018, which means she lived for 89 years and spent the substantial majority of her adult life, from her early 20s until her death at 88. Actively working to support former SS members and to maintain the social networks that connected the surviving elements of the old Nazi world. Her involvement with Stille Hilfe, documented over many decades by German intelligence services, was not a youthful indiscretion or a temporary phase of denial that eventually gave way to historical understanding. It was a lifetime commitment, pursued with consistent determination across more than 6 decades. When she died in 2018, she had outlived almost everyone who could remember the Third Reich from personal experience, and she died without having made any public concession to the historical judgment of what her father had done. The German news coverage of her death noted her continued association with neo-Nazi networks and her lifelong refusal to accept any criticism of Heinrich Himmler, documenting in its brevity and its matter-of-factness the sad and infuriating stability of her ideological position. The story of Edda Göring, who died in the same year as Gudrun Berwitz, also deserves a final reflection. The 2 women who died in 2018 represented something like the last of the direct children of the senior Nazi leadership, the final generation with personal memories of the fathers whose actions had shaped everything in their lives. With their deaths, the history of the Nazi families moved definitively from living memory into the documentary record, from the realm of personal testimony into the realm of historical scholarship. The children and grandchildren who remain alive are already 1 or 2 steps removed from the men whose choices set the catastrophe in motion, and their relationship to that history is mediated through family stories, documents, photographs, and the ongoing cultural and legal processes of German and European societies that continue to work through the implications of what happened between 1933 and 1945. What does it mean to be the wife or the child of a man who committed crimes against humanity? There is no single answer to this question, and the lives we have examined in this video demonstrate its variety. It means carrying a name that others recognize and react to with disgust or horror or a complicated mixture of emotions. It means making choices about acknowledgement and disclosure and public engagement that ordinary people never have to consider. It means living in relationship to a history that is also inescapably a family history. And it means finding ways, each in their own manner, to continue living in a world that was shaped in part by the actions of the men they were connected to. The wives of the Nazi elite were women of their time, shaped by the particular patriarchal structures of early 20th century German society, and by the extraordinary circumstances of the Nazi movement's rise to power. Many of them came to their husbands' ideological commitments through paths that made psychological sense within their biographical contexts, through youthful enthusiasm, through family connections, through romantic attraction to charismatic men. This does not excuse them, but it does help to explain them. An explanation is different from exculpation. Understanding how ordinary people became complicit in extraordinary evil is one of the most important projects that historical study of the Nazi era can undertake, because that understanding is what equips us to recognize the warning signs when comparable dynamics emerge in other contexts. The children, equally, were born into circumstances they did not choose and had no power to alter. The spectrum of their responses, from Gudrun Himmler's lifelong denial to Niklas Frank's furious public condemnation, from Rolf Mengele's painful silence to Albert Speer Jr.'s quiet professional separation, represents the full range of human possibility in the face of an unbearable inheritance. None of them could escape who they were and where they came from. But within those constraints, they made choices that define their lives and that tell us something important about the human capacity for both self-deception and moral courage. The history of what happened to the top Nazi wives and children after World War II is, ultimately, a history of the long aftermath of catastrophe, of the ways in which the consequences of great crimes reverberate through the lives of people who are not themselves the primary agents of those crimes, but who are close enough to them to be permanently altered by their proximity. It is a history that reminds us that the victims of the Nazi era are not the only ones whose post-war lives were marked by what happened. The perpetrators' families were marked too, in very different ways and without anything approaching the same degree of suffering, but marked nonetheless. And in that marking, in the diversity of responses and the long struggle to find adequate ways of living with impossible knowledge, lies some of the most revealing and most human material that the history of the Second World War has to offer. We must also examine the specific and often overlooked stories of the women who married senior SS officers below the very top tier of the Nazi hierarchy. Women whose lives after the war were shaped by the crimes of their husbands, but who existed below the radar of the major Nuremberg proceedings and instead faced the more localized justice of the military tribunal system or the German denazification courts. Erna Bach, the wife of Erich Bach-Zelewski, who commanded SS and police forces responsible for the mass murder of hundreds of thousands of civilians in the occupied Soviet Union, and who played a central role in the brutal suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, endured a post-war life shaped by the extraordinary legal convolutions of her husband's case. Erich Bach-Zelewski was one of the few major war criminals who actually cooperated with the prosecution at Nuremberg, testifying as a witness against other defendants, a decision that had complex consequences for his own prosecution. He was eventually tried and convicted by German courts in the 1960s and died in prison in 1972, having served only a portion of a sentence that critics argued was grotesquely disproportionate to the scale of his crimes. The experience of Dorothea von Dirksen, a prominent socialite who had connections to many senior Nazi figures, and who after the war worked to maintain the social networks that had sustained the Nazi elite during its years in power, illustrates how the informal structures of the Nazi social world persisted into the post-war era through the continued relationships of the women who had anchored them. Social historians of Nazi Germany have increasingly recognized the importance of these informal networks, the dinner parties and social gatherings and correspondence networks maintained by the wives of the elite, as mechanisms through which Nazi ideology was sustained and transmitted even within what appeared on the surface to be ordinary social life. The children of Joachim von Ribbentrop, the executed foreign minister, provide another case study in how the family members of executed Nazis navigated the post-war world. Rudolf von Ribbentrop, one of Joachim's sons, served in the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS and was wounded on the Eastern Front. After the war, he worked in business and in his later years published materials defending his father's reputation, following the pattern of filial loyalty that we have seen in so many other cases. His view of his father and of the Nazi era remained deeply shaped by the emotional bonds of the family relationship, rather than by the historical judgment that the Nuremberg verdicts represented. The tension between these two perspectives, the historical and the familial, is something that runs through virtually every story we have examined, and that never finds a clean resolution. The children of Heinrich Himmler's secret second family, the two children he had with his secretary Hedwig Potthast, whose existence Margarete Himmler discovered in 1941, represent yet another dimension of this already complex picture. Helga Potthast and Nanette Dorothea Potthast grew up with the stigma of illegitimacy added to the stigma of their father's crimes, a double burden that placed them in a position of particular marginalization within the post-war German social world. Their existence was known but rarely publicly discussed, and their lives after the war remained largely outside the historical record. Hedwig Potthast herself spent the post-war years avoiding public attention as completely as she could, living under a changed name and refusing to engage with the historical questions that surrounded her relationship with one of history's most prolific mass murderers. The remarkable case of Hannah Reitsch, while she was not technically a wife or child of a senior Nazi, but rather one of the most celebrated women in the Third Reich as a record-breaking test pilot and aviatrix, intersects with our broader theme because of her extraordinary and entirely unreconstructed post-war life. Hannah Reitsch had been one of Hitler's favourite celebrities, a woman who embodied the physical courage and achievement that Nazi ideology claimed to value, and she had flown into the besieged Berlin in April 1945 in one of the last flights that anyone made to or from Hitler's capital in the final days of the war. After the war, she was held by American forces for over a year and interrogated extensively. She was released without charge. Her post-war life was a remarkable story of determined professional rehabilitation. She resumed her aviation career, setting new gliding records well into the 1970s, and travelled extensively to newly independent African nations, where she worked to establish gliding programs, a dimension of her post-war life that has been interpreted both as genuine public service and as a form of self-rehabilitation that conveniently placed her in environments far from European historical scrutiny. She remained entirely unrepentant about her admiration for Hitler until her death in 1979, another example of the ideological constancy that characterized so many who had stood near the center of the Nazi enterprise. The wives and children of the men who led the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the German army into the Soviet Union and murdered an estimated 1.5 million Jewish people in mass shootings before the industrialized death camps were fully operational, represent a particularly dark subset of this broader category. The commanders of the Einsatzgruppen were tried at Nuremberg in the Einsatzgruppen trial of 1947 and 1948, with 14 defendants receiving death sentences, though only 4 of these were actually carried out. Their wives and children lived with the particular knowledge that the men in their families had been convicted specifically and explicitly of mass murder. The wife of Otto Uhlendorf, the commander of Einsatzgruppe, D, who was responsible for the murder of approximately 90,000 people and who was hanged in 1951 after his death sentence was upheld, faced this knowledge in its most concentrated form. The Uhlendorf family's post-war circumstances are illustrative of the broader pattern of material deprivation, social stigma, and personal psychological burden that characterized the lives of the families of executed war criminals. One of the more striking features of the post-war landscape we are examining is the extent to which time itself functioned as a kind of partial rehabilitation for many of these individuals. As the immediate emergency of denazification and war crimes trials gave way to the demands of Cold War politics, as West Germany became an important Western ally against Soviet communism, the political pressure to thoroughly prosecute every dimension of Nazi criminality relaxed considerably. Former Nazis found their way back into German professional life, government, business, and even the judiciary and law enforcement, a phenomenon that later German historians documented with considerable embarrassment. The families of former Nazis benefited from this broader social pattern. The stigma attached to having a Nazi father or husband became more manageable as the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, and then the 1970s. Not because the crimes were forgotten or forgiven in any moral sense, but because the social and professional landscape became progressively more tolerant of people who had been connected to the regime. This pattern began to reverse in the 1960s with the Eichmann trial in Israel, which brought the systematic planning and execution of the Holocaust back to the center of public attention in a way that the Nuremberg proceedings, conducted immediately after the war and received in a state of collective shock, had not fully achieved. Adolf Eichmann, who had administered the logistics of the deportation of Jews to the death camps and who had been captured by Israeli agents in Argentina and brought to trial in Jerusalem, was convicted and executed in 1962. His trial was broadcast on television and followed intensely by audiences in Germany and around the world, and it reinvigorated the public discussion of Nazi criminality and individual responsibility in ways that had lasting effects on German culture. The children of the Nazi elite, who were young adults in the 1960s, absorbed this renewed public engagement with the crimes of their parents' generation, and it influenced how many of them chose to relate to their own family histories. The student movements of the late 1960s in West Germany had a particular dimension that was not present in the student movements of other countries, namely a direct and often anguished confrontation with the parents' and grandparents' complicity in the Nazi era. Young West Germans in 1968 were literally confronting their parents about what they had done and what they had known, and this generational confrontation became one of the formative experiences of post-war German political culture. For the children and grandchildren of the Nazi elite, this broader cultural movement intersected directly with their own family dynamics, as the questions being raised by the student movement were questions about the specific individuals in their own homes, rather than about an abstract collective guilt. Monika Hertwig, the daughter of Armin Goeth, the concentration camp commandant of the Płaszów labor camp in Poland, who was depicted with terrifying power by Ralph Fiennes in the film Schindler's List, has given extensive interviews about her experience of discovering who her father was and what he had done. Goethe was tried by a Polish court, convicted, and hanged in Krakow in September 1946, dying when Monika was just 3 years old. She grew up knowing nothing about who her father really was, her mother having carefully concealed the truth. The discovery of her father's identity and the historical record of his crimes came to her as an adult, a moment of biographical rupture that she has described in terms of profound shock and lasting psychological disruption. What makes Monika Hertwig's case particularly striking in the context of historical reconciliation is that she eventually sought out and met Helen Jonas Rosenzweig, one of her father's surviving victims, a woman who had worked as a household servant in Armin Goeth's villa and who had lived under his capricious and lethal cruelty. The meeting between the daughter of a war criminal and his surviving victim, documented in the film titled Inheritance, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of post-war human encounter that the historical record contains. Both women spoke movingly about the experience of meeting each other, about what it means to carry the burdens they each carry, and about the possibility of some form of human connection across the gulf of what was done and what was suffered. The journey of Bettina Goering, the grandniece of Hermann Goering, who voluntarily chose sterilization, has taken her to New Mexico in the American Southwest, far from the European world that produced the Nazi catastrophe. She has spoken in documentary films about the reasoning behind her decision, explaining it as a refusal to pass on what she perceives as a poisoned inheritance, a decision that is both deeply personal and deeply strange given what we know about the genetic irrelevance of her connection to Hermann Goering. Goering's crimes were not biological in origin and cannot be transmitted through DNA. Yet the psychological reality of Bettina's experience of her family identity is that the connection to her great-uncle felt like a contamination that she could address through a physical act. Her decision invites complex reflection about the ways in which the children and grandchildren of perpetrators internalize guilt that is not in any rational sense theirs to carry, and about the psychological mechanisms by which historical crimes become personal wounds, even at 2 or 3 removes from the acts themselves. The comparison between the children who chose to confront their family histories publicly and those who chose silence or denial reveals something important about the nature of historical responsibility as it is experienced within families. Niklas Frank and Gudrun Himmler are polar opposites within this spectrum, one having spent his life publicly denouncing his father's crimes, and the other having spent hers defending her father's memory. Yet both of them were shaped by the same fundamental experience of being the child of a man who occupied a position at or near the centre of one of history's most terrible criminal enterprises. The difference in their responses was not merely a matter of individual personality, though personality certainly played a role. It was also a matter of the specific nature of their relationship with their fathers, of the information they had access to at key developmental moments, and of the broader social and political contexts in which they formed their adult identities. What happened to the wives and children of the Nazi elite after the war is, in one sense, a set of individual biographical stories that happen to involve people with unusual family histories. But, in a larger sense, these stories are documents of how a society collectively processes the consequences of historical catastrophe, how the mechanisms of love and loyalty and denial and accountability play out across generations when the crimes in question are of such unprecedented scale. Germany's process of coming to terms with the Nazi era has been a generation-spanning project that is still not complete, and the lives of the women and children we have examined in this video are threads within that larger fabric. The final word on these lives belongs perhaps to the survivors themselves and to the families of the victims whose voices are the necessary counterpoint to everything we have discussed. The children of Holocaust victims grew up carrying their own version of the impossible inheritance, the absence of grandparents and great-grandparents who were murdered, the silence around kitchen tables where stories should have been told, the photographs that ended abruptly in 1942 or 1943, the names that no one could quite bring themselves to say. Their post-war experience and the post-war experiences of the families we have been examining are not equivalent, but they are connected by the same historical events that produced such different effects depending on which side of the catastrophe one was born on. The women who married the men of the Third Reich and the children born into those families inherited, each in their own way, a piece of the wreckage that those men left behind. Some used that inheritance to continue, in whatever attenuated form they could manage, the project their husbands and fathers had served. Some used it to atone, or to educate, or to try to build something that could partially redress the weight of what had been done. And some simply tried to live, quietly and without drawing attention, in the hope that the passage of time would eventually be sufficient to allow them to be something other than the wife or child of a man who had helped destroy the world. What we have learned from examining these lives in detail is that history does not end when wars do, and that the consequences of great crimes ramify through time in ways that affect the innocent alongside the guilty. The wives and children of the Nazi elite were not, for the most part, morally innocent. They were embedded in a world that was producing atrocity, and most of them knew at some level what was happening around them, even if the specific mechanisms and the full scale of it remained partially obscured. But they were also human beings, whose emotional bonds to the men in their lives were genuine, whose post-war experiences were shaped by forces that went far beyond their individual choices, and whose stories, however troubling, deserve careful historical attention, precisely because of what they reveal about the ordinary human dimensions of extraordinary evil. The wives and children of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany provide us with an essential reminder that history is made not just by the dramatic decisions of historical actors in positions of power, but also by the choices made by all the people who surround them, who support them, who love them, and who must live with the consequences of what they did. Their stories are part of the full accounting of what the Third Reich was and what it left behind, and they deserve to be told with the same seriousness and rigour that we bring to the stories of the men whose names history has made unforgettable for all the worst reasons. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking if you enjoyed learning about the remarkable and often disturbing post-war lives of the wives and children of the Nazi elite. Make sure to check out our other videos exploring the aftermath of World War II, including what happened to Germany's top generals, the fate of the Waffen-SS, and the final destinies of Germany's field marshals. There is always more to learn about this pivotal period in history, and we're dedicated to bringing you the most compelling and thoroughly researched content about the Second World War. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on all of our latest World War II content. See you in the next one.